This video shows the installation for Falcon shocks on the Ram 1500. These shocks fit on the 5th generation of the Ram 1500, which came into production in 2019. They fit all models, including the Rebel. These shocks do not fit on the Ram 1500 Classic, which is the 4th generation. However, Falcon shocks for the Ram 1500 Classic are available. Begin the installation process by lifting the vehicle off the ground and removing the tires. The front shocks utilize factory strut components, so we will remove the factory strut. Disconnect the tie rod end from the knuckle. Remove the hub nut. Loosen the nut on the ball joint that connects the upper control arm to the knuckle. Use a pair of hammers or an air hammer to loosen the stud. Once it's loose, push down on the upper control arm and remove the nut. It's also good to detach the ABS line from the upper control arm before you disconnect the upper control arm from the knuckle. Remove the hardware connecting the lower end of the shock to the lower control arm. Make sure the hub is loose. You may have to use a hammer to loosen it, but we didn't need to do that. Remove the nut on the sway bar link so it can move freely. Remove the support from the lower control arm. Remove the nuts on top of the strut and the whole thing should come right out. To make sure the strut goes back together correctly, mark the top of the spring where it lines up with the outer stud on the strut mount and the bottom of the spring where it lines up with the center of the fork bracket. Use a spring compressor and remove the factory shock from the strut. Once the spring is removed, take the roost guard out of the strut mount and spring isolator assembly. Falcon shocks can be adjusted to one of 4 ride height settings. Stock is the lowest ride height. This ride height setting matches the stock strut. Medium is for those who wish to have a level appearance when there is a consistent load in the truck bed. Level will give a level ride height with no load in the truck bed. This is the preset ride height of the shock out of the box. Heavy accessory is for those vehicles with steel bumpers and/or winches, or other accessories that weigh down the front end. After choosing the ride height, place the coil carrier and spring retainer onto the Falcon shock. Put the bump stop onto the shaft with the wide end going up. Set the factory spring into place with the factory isolator and strut mount on top. It's important that the spring isolator and strut mount are installed with the correct orientation onto the Falcon shock. The forked end is offset so the shock will not make contact with the shafts. This offset points to the rear of the vehicle. Install the shock into the strut assembly with this in mind. Tighten the nut until it bottoms out, then release the spring compressor. Use a pry bar to keep the strut mount from spinning and torque the top nut to 40 foot-pounds. Install the strut back into the vehicle using the factory hardware. Reinstall the nut on the sway bar link. reattach the upper control arm to the top of the knuckle by pressing down on the control arm using a pry bar. Make sure the hub is in place before you tighten this nut. Don't forget to reattach the ABS line. Reconnect the tie rod end to the knuckle. Replace the hub nut. Use red thread locker on this, you definitely don't want it to come loose. The rear tow haul Falcon shocks have a 3-position fast adjust knob for large damper adjustments. These settings are Sport, which matches the tune of the Sport monotube shocks, Moderate tow haul for light, medium loads or small trailers, and Heavy tow haul for larger loads and large trailers. Increasing the stiffness of the rear shocks when towing or hauling improves driving stability and decreases the sway and bounciness often encountered when towing or hauling large loads. To install the rear shocks, you need to remove the inner fender liner. Support the axle and remove the factory shocks. Reuse the factory bushings and install the upper end. The shock's reservoir points towards the rear of the vehicle. Avoid letting the reservoir or body cap make contact with the frame. There's no way to get a torque wrench up on top of the post, but we made the threads end at the point where it will be the correct torque. So simply tighten until the nut won't turn anymore. Install the lower end reusing the factory hardware. If you wish to reinstall the inner fender liner, then cut a hole using the provided template to access the knob.